Australia just announced emergency fuel security measures, not because of a natural disaster, not because of domestic supply issues, because of a war in the Middle East 7,000 miles away. When a country that far from the conflict zone runs out of fuel options, the war has no borders. My name is Professor Jiang. I study geopolitics and predictive military analysis, and what I am about to show you is not just a story about Australian fuel policy. It is an analytical breakdown of how modern warfare creates cascading vulnerabilities that reach every corner of the global economy, and why that matters for every American watching this video. Stay with me, because the number I give you at the 8-minute mark of this video is the most important data point about global supply chain vulnerability that has entered the public domain since this war began. Do not leave before you hear it. Now let me show you what Australia actually announced and why it matters for the global economy. Here is what we know. The Australian government announced today that it is activating emergency fuel security measures under the Liquid Fuel Security Act. These measures include mandatory fuel stockpiling requirements for major importers, priority allocation protocols for essential services, and price stabilization mechanisms to prevent market manipulation during supply disruptions. The trigger for these measures is not domestic shortage. It is the risk of supply chain disruption from the Iran conflict. Australia imports approximately 90% of its liquid fuel. A significant portion of those imports transit the Strait of Hormuz or are sourced from refineries in the Middle East and Asia that depend on Middle Eastern crude. When the Strait of Hormuz is threatened, when insurance premiums for tankers spike, when shipping routes are rerouted, the entire global fuel supply chain feels the pressure. Now here is the number I promised you, the one that changes everything. Australia's emergency measures are designed to maintain a minimum of 90 days of fuel reserves for critical infrastructure. 90 days, that is the international standard for energy security. But here is the part that should stop you cold. Australia's current fuel reserves before the activation of these emergency measures were estimated at approximately 45 days. That means Australia was operating at half the international standard for energy security, and Australia is not unique. Most developed nations operate with fuel reserves well below the 90-day standard because maintaining those reserves is expensive and because the global supply chain has historically been reliable enough to make large stockpiles seem unnecessary. The Iran conflict has changed that calculation. When a critical choke point like the Strait of Hormuz is threatened, the reliability assumption no longer holds. And when the reliability assumption no longer holds, every nation that depends on imported fuel must reassess its security posture. Let me now show you why this matters analytically. Beyond the immediate Australian policy story, because this is where the Professor Jiang analysis adds something that straight news reporting does not. Global supply chains are not just economic networks, they are strategic vulnerabilities. When a nation depends on imported fuel, food, or critical materials, it is not just making an economic choice. It is making a strategic choice to accept vulnerability in exchange for efficiency. That choice works when the world is stable. It fails when the world is not. The Iran conflict is testing that choice for every nation that depends on imported energy. Australia is the first to announce emergency measures, but it will not be the last. Now I want to show you the historical pattern because this has happened before, and the outcome was not good for the nations that waited too long to act. In 1973, during the Arab oil embargo, nations that depended on imported oil faced sudden supply disruptions. Those that had strategic reserves were able to buffer the shock. Those that did not face immediate economic crisis. The embargo lasted 5 months. The nations that recovered fastest were those that had invested in energy security before the crisis. In 1990, during the Gulf War, oil prices spiked from $18 per barrel to over $40 per barrel. Nations with strategic reserves were able to stabilize their domestic markets. Nations without reserves faced inflation, recession, and political instability. The pattern is clear when a global supply chain is disrupted. The nations that prepared in advance suffer less. The nations that wait until the crisis hits suffer more. And the nations that never prepare at all face existential risk. Now I want to show you what Australia's emergency measures actually mean for the global fuel market, because this is the layer that no news channel is providing. Australia's announcement will trigger 3 specific market responses. First, other fuel importing nations in the Asia-Pacific region will likely announce similar measures. Japan, South Korea, and New Zealand all depend on imported fuel and all face similar supply chain vulnerabilities. If they follow Australia's lead, the collective demand for fuel reserves will increase, putting upward pressure on global fuel prices. Second, fuel exporters will likely adjust their pricing and allocation strategies. When importing nations begin to stockpile, exporters can charge premium prices and prioritize customers based on strategic relationships rather than market mechanisms. This shifts the balance of power in the global fuel market from buyers to sellers. Third, insurance markets will likely reassess risk premiums for fuel shipments. When nations announce emergency measures, it signals that they perceive a heightened risk of supply disruption. Insurance companies respond by increasing premiums, which increases the cost of fuel transportation, which further increases the final price to consumers. Each of these market responses is rational from the perspective of the actors involved, but collectively they create a feedback loop that amplifies the initial supply chain disruption, and that feedback loop has consequences for every nation that depends on imported fuel. Let me now give you the 3 specific signals to watch in the next 72 hours that will tell you whether Australia's announcement is an isolated policy response or the beginning of a broader global shift. The first signal is any announcement of similar emergency fuel security measures by other Asia-Pacific nations. If Japan, South Korea, or New Zealand announce comparable measures within the next 72 hours, it means the regional response is coordinated. If no such announcements occur, it means Australia is acting alone. The second signal is any change in global fuel price benchmarks. If Brent crude, WTI, or Singapore fuel oil prices increase significantly in response to Australia's announcement, it means the market is pricing in broader supply chain risk. If prices remain stable, it means the market views Australia's measures as an isolated policy response. The third signal is any statement from major fuel exporters about allocation priorities. If Saudi Arabia, the WEI, or other major exporters announce changes to their fuel export policies in response to Australia's announcement, it means the supply side of the market is reacting. If no such statements occur, it means the supply side remains unchanged. Before I close, I want to come back to something that connects this analytical work to your personal life. I do this work every day because I believe people deserve analysis that goes deeper than the headline, that reads the letter inside the envelope rather than just describing the envelope itself. Doing that work at this level every day at age 63 requires a body and a mind that can sustain the pace. Advanced amino formula has been a genuine part of how I maintain that capacity. After 40, your body stops absorbing protein the way it did when you were younger. It converts much of it to sugar instead of using it to maintain and rebuild muscle. The result is the gradual energy decline and mental fog that most people over 40 accept. As normal aging, it is not normal aging. It is a nutritional gap. Specifically, the 8 essential amino acids your body needs but can no longer extract efficiently from the food and protein supplements you give it. Advanced Amino delivers all 8 in the ratio your cells can actually use with almost zero waste. That is why it hits differently from protein shakes and other supplements I tried before. The link is in the pinned comment and in the description below. They offer a full 90-day money-back guarantee if you do not feel different. In 2 weeks, return it. Zero risk. But I am telling you from my own experience at 63, covering these stories at full intensity every day, when your body has what it actually needs, everything else becomes easier. Australia just announced emergency fuel security measures because of a war 7,000 miles away. When a country that far from the conflict zone runs out of fuel options, the war has no borders. The morning shows will cover this as a policy footnote below missile counts and oil prices. They will not show you the strategic vulnerability. They will not show you the historical pattern. They will not show you what this means for the global supply chain and for your household budget. Now you have all of it. Subscribe right now if this gave you the analytical depth that the news cycle is not providing. Drop a comment below with yes or no. Do you believe other Asia-Pacific nations will announce similar emergency fuel security measures in the next 72 hours? I read every single comment. I will see you tomorrow.